morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Nicole Golden, non-resident senior fellow with the Geoeconomic Center at the Atlantic Council. And I'm joined here live with Jorge Moreira da Silva. He's the UN Undersecretary General and Executive Director of the UN Office for Project Services, otherwise known as UNOPS. Welcome. Thank you for
Nicole.
joining me. We are coming into the final hours of the spring meetings, and if there is one thing on everyone's mind, it is the IDA, the International Development Association's replenishment. Earlier in the week, the World Bank released its Great Reversal report, which painted a pretty alarming picture for the countries of IDA, the 75 eligible countries, the low-income countries, painting a picture of loss of development gains. 1 out of every 3 IDA countries is poorer now than it was on the eve of the pandemic. And more than half of them have been growing slower than wealthier countries since 2020. So it's an important time for IDA. How does UNOPS fit into the IDA landscape, and what are you focusing on with this year's replenishment?
Thank you, Nicole. And indeed, I've been attending spring meetings for the last decade, and this one is particularly important as we are taking stock. We are not taking stock just on the sustainable development goals, we are taking stock on development.
Yeah.
And development is a fundamental approach to eradicate poverty, to address inequalities, and also to broadly approach sustainable development. Unfortunately, the proliferation of crises, the succession of crises that are piling up have exacerbated inequalities within and between countries. I know that we tend to approach crises as they are being pumped up in headlines, but we should not forget that most developing countries are still dealing with the consequence of COVID. And then we saw the other crises that were impacting them. So I think that the report that is being released, the commitment to support developing countries is most welcome. I think that we shall approach this not just from a financing point of view, but also policy and implementation. I think that if there is something that we have learned, is that finance alone cannot fix the problem. Finance is a sine qua non condition. And I think that we should all be proud of IDA role. IDA has been playing a fundamental role with $1 being provided. It mobilizes 4 additional dollars. It has been a vital source of support to developing countries. But when we go through the figures, we realize that the supply alone won't fix the problem. Even if we mobilize more, and we need to mobilize more, much more, at the end of the day, there are other bottlenecks that need to be addressed. And those bottlenecks are policy, the enabling context to make sure that each dollar that is provided will flourish, will have a catalyzer role towards development gains, but also the implementation gap, which is UNOPS' main concern. UNOPS is the UN Agency for Operations.
Yep.
We work in 85 countries through procurement, infrastructure, project management. We have no programmatic role, no normative role. We are just there supporting our partners, being the bank, the developing countries, the UN sister agencies, expanding our partners' capacity for implementation. And that's why we focus very much on the bottlenecks on implementation. So I would say that this commitment on the replenishment of IDA, the need to mobilize more, to mobilize better, to align more finance with policy, should also be complemented with all efforts that are needed to address the implementation gap bottlenecks.
It's really important, and I know, as you said, UNOPS actually delivers on the ground a lot of that IDA funding, whether it's with and through other UN agencies or directly sometimes with governments. And I know a large share of your work with the World Bank, with IDA, over nearly 85%, I believe, is in fragile and conflict-affected societies. And you talked about ongoing crises. We are certainly seeing increasing conflict and fragility events around the world. It is undermining economic growth. It is creating food security situations. It's related to the debt challenges. Tell us a little bit more about your work in Mozambique, South Sudan, Yemen, just to name a few of the countries. How is UNOPS able to make impact in work in these difficult settings? And what does, what do you see as that kind of fragility impact on the work that you do?
If there is something that makes me proud, Nicole, is the fact that we stay and deliver in the most challenging context. If you approach development from a marketplace point of view,
Yeah.
I know that not everyone loves this approach, but if you approach this as a marketplace with supply and demand,
Yep.
with the competition of resources from ODA, blended finance, impact investment, concessional finance, non-concessional finance, commercial finance, from a supply point of view, and then from the demand side, the enabling context and developing countries developing their own strategies to attract investment, the risk is having a market failure, which is going not to those most in need, but approaching where it is easier and faster to spend. So if we keep the focus on the speed meter, if we just assess our achievements just on how fast, how quicker we spend, we will be missing the real impact. And it's where I think that the partnership between UNOPS and World Bank is working so well, because with the bank, we are basically working in the most difficult context. It's not by accident that UNOPS is the second largest partner of the World Bank, and when it comes to FCVs, so the fragile, highly fragile, conflict and violent context, we are number one.
Yep.
So we are the number one in terms of the partner that the bank approaches to when it comes to implementing in the most difficult context. And if it wouldn't be about this partnership, we would not have impacted citizens in Myanmar, in Yemen, in Mozambique, in Afghanistan, in Ukraine, in those really difficult contexts. So I think that this is a good example of the partnership. The reason I'm so worried, I would say, about the trends, and going back to your first question, is because even when I see positive trends in terms of volumes, it is not going to those most in need. Let me give you just a couple examples.
Please.
Blended finance.
Yep.
Blended finance is on the rise. We know that this idea of crowding in public and private money was a new concept after Addis. It has received lots of support, and now we have roughly $50 billion per year of private finance that is mobilized through official initiatives. So the governments, the MDBs, the national governments, they create official initiatives, public initiatives, to leverage private money. And this leveraging effect has reached more or less 50 billion. So let's ask, where is this money going?
Yeah.
Only 12% of the blended finance goes to low-income countries. Only 12%. And only 7% goes to the social sectors, health and education. So you see that blended finance is on the rise, but it's going to upper middle-income countries. Middle-income countries, that's nothing wrong about that, because those countries, they also need the crowding in of public and private money. But we are not targeting those most in need. And the same when it comes to sectors.
Yep.
The blended finance is going to energy, to infrastructure, but not to health and education. So it's one signal. The second is foreign direct investment.
Yep.
Only 10% of foreign direct investment is going to fragile context.
Wow.
And you have 80% of the people, of the poorest, will live in fragile context in 2030, yet only 10% of FDI goes to fragile context. Another example. Everyone talks about sustainable investment, sustainable finance, the green bonds, all this commitment of going greener and greening the investment, which is going in the right direction, not with the right pace, but still in the right direction. But let's dig into the equality, sustainability dimension. 97% of all the new sustainable investment funds are being hosted in high-income countries. 97%. So even when we are going greener, we are becoming more unequal. So I think that it's precisely, and I could spend the next hour giving you examples, Nicole, of how fragile context, violent contexts are not getting the support they need. That's why I think that the commitment from the bank and UNOPS to partner in those contexts are fundamental to overcome a market failure.
It's really important. And when you talk in supply and demand, I'm an economist, so it's language I certainly understand, and it's a really important dynamic. The fragile and conflict affected countries, the low-income countries, we're also seeing that a big situation, and this has been part of the conversation here alongside the private capital mobilization conversation, is around debt. And to that point, the debt and the debt service is further creating fiscal pressures on these countries with less money to spend. It's debt services diverting resources from their spending and ability to spend on health, education, as well as climate adaptation and climate mitigation. So if you can just talk a little bit more about how you see that relationship, and UNOPS and just your broader experience work on, how does this relate to, how do we continue to push for more inclusive and equitable growth, as well as that just energy transition in these environments?
Well, the energy sector is a good example of the paradox that we are facing and the opportunities that we must tackle and take. We have seen an amazing transformation of the energy sector in the last decade. I think that the tech revolution
Yeah.
went well beyond what the most optimists were expecting, but still you have 1/3 of the population relying on fuel and biomass to cook, more than 600 million people without access to electricity, and this paradox that is Africa being the home of 60% of the solar potential, only getting 3% of all the investments on energy, and just getting 1.5% of the photovoltaic projects being installed. So clearly, this shows why just relying on policies and the private sector won't work.
Yep.
Because you need the enabling context, and it's where solidarity matters.
Yep.
I'm particularly worried with energy, because I think that we are not getting the results with the speed that is needed. And I think that for those that are listening to our conversation, numbers matter. I always like to bring
We love
numbers
data,
because,
we love numbers.
because it illustrates
Absolutely.
the challenge. If we are to be serious about the Paris Agreement, if we want to really have a chance to deliver on 1.5 degree, we would need to increase renewable energy by 3 times until 2030, increase energy efficiency by 2-fold. This was all delivered or agreed in Dubai. But then what would really be needed in terms of financing? We would need $1.7 trillion a year on clean energy. 1.7 trillion. This shows that it won't be possible with the public sector alone. So it's ODA, it's 230 billion, and you need 1.7 trillion just on energy. But at the same time, the public finance matters to enable the private investment. So everything that is about capacity building, technical assistance is very important. Going back to your point on IDA, we realize that in low-income countries, and particularly in conflict-affected countries, the disbursement of the IDA is quite low. Only 50% of IDA has been disbursed in LDCs.
So even the money that's there
Exactly.
is not actually flowing.
So we should ask ourselves why.
Yeah.
So if the bank is committed to provide the finance, if the governments were interested in getting that finance, why at the end of the day we have still 50% of the finance that was committed not being disbursed in LDCs and fragile contexts? And I think that one key element is technical assistance. I know that for those that work on development, we are used to this jargon.
Yeah.
And I know that it's not as fancy as other elements in conversations here in DC or in New York, because we tend to discuss a lot about the trillions. But technical assistance, which is designing projects, training, ensuring that the projects are well planned, that they are bankable,
Yep.
that they follow accountability mechanism, the right risk management. Those kind of elements needs to be addressed if we want to unblock these bottlenecks. And I think to go back to your question, and sorry if I deviate a bit, you were talking about debt. We could have a conversation now about tax, or about investment, or about aid.
Yep.
And I think that we are having this conversation in a fragmented approach.
Yes.
Where are we discussing that? We
Yep.
are discussing that at the Paris Club, where not all the real stakeholders and shareholders have a seat, and we are discussing that at the G20.
Yep.
And also, of course, at IMF. Where are we discussing tax? We are discussing tax in fragmented context.
Absolutely.
Where are we discussing FFD,
Yep.
being ODA? It's in Paris, but at OECD. But what about South-South?
Right.
Which is now very relevant. And by the way, where are we taking full ownership and accountability on blended finance and impact investment?
Yeah.
There is no place that is setting norms and standards and holding providers into account. So I feel that the development landscape has significantly changed, but the institutional arrangements are not aligned with the sophistication of this marketplace.
Absolutely. So much to pick up on, and so little time.
Yeah.
George, on the energy transition piece and the links to inclusive growth, I just want to go back to that and just a comment, because I think one of the pieces of the conversation that maybe isn't getting as much, although some airtime, so to speak, is the opportunity, right? You talked about all of the renewable, the aspects of the energy and the just transition and the investments that need to be made. But to go back to the lower income and a lot of the broader sort of development communities, they tend to be young, right? They tend to be youthful. And that link back to inclusive growth is the opportunity in the energy transition for job creation, for young people, for women to get more involved in energy companies and the supply chains around kind of energy. And so, to see that work and seeing those connections being made, I think kind of speaks to some of the more of the opportunistic side of the work and the investments that are being made. So I just wanted to bring that up. You mentioned the FFD and the project on the deliverable side. You are heading from here back up to New York for the UN Financing for Development Forum next week. How do you sort of drill down on what messages you're bringing from here to there, and in particular, whether it's the tax and the domestic resource mobilization, which is kind of linked back to the increasing labor force participation piece I mentioned. How are you sort of thinking about that sort of delivery side, and when you think about the role of sort of UNOPS in that sort of demand side of FFD?
Well, starting with energy.
Yeah.
On energy, I completely share your approach about opportunities. We would always need to address it, but in this case, it would be really a shame, because we have all the reasons to be ambitious on energy, because we know that the decarbonization will generate not just an environmental outcome, but also a social outcome and an economic outcome. So we will not be forgiven by the next generations with information that we have now. So we know that green transition on energy generates a positive outcome. On renewable energy, we are expecting an increase of jobs, in terms of a fourfold increase of jobs on renewable energy. And I think that it's important to approach energy from the outcome that it generates. I'm an electrical engineer, and we tend to talk about energy in terms of megawatts.
Yep.
I think that we need to talk more about the megawatt hour, which is indeed not just the capacity installed, but the real energy that is being provided. But more importantly than that, the use, and more importantly than that, the social outcomes and economic outcomes. Because energy matters because of the number of women that are empowered, the number of kids that can go to school, the number of people that have access to education and to health, the number of people that can use the sustainable mobility. So I think that and I heard the president of the bank speaking this week about that. I think that it's important to address energy, climate, and other sustainable development goals from an outcome point of view on the number of people that are impacted rather than an output point of view, which is a mind shift. But going to your question about FFD next week and the spring meetings this week, there is one area where I'm particularly worried, which is the impact of conflicts and wars on financing for development. And we need both. We need more finance to humanitarian, and we need more finance to development. And what we have seen is, in the last decade, is a shift from development towards humanitarian. So we are more in a band-aid firefighting approach, and I hope that we will not lose sight and focus on the prevention agenda. And the bank has done fantastic research showing that $1 invested on prevention generates a positive outcome of $16, which is we would spend $16 more than what we invest on prevention due to the negative impacts of wars and crises. And if you see what's happening at ODA, the figures were launched just this week. Humanitarian aid and in-donor refugee costs today represent 26% of ODA. So humanitarian and in-donor refugee costs. So the emergency-driven spending.
Right.
In 2012, it was just 10%. So it started with the Syrian crisis in 2015, and it never went down. So we see now with Ukraine and with other conflicts, Gaza, clearly the need for more humanitarian, and we really need more humanitarian aid, but I think that we need additionality. So rather than a shift from development to humanitarian, we need additionality, which is something that I've heard, of course, this week. Another area where I think that we, UNOPS, can play a role, and it's something that I will share with colleagues next week at FFD, is UNOPS, we don't have a role on financing for sustainable development from a supply point of view. So we do not provide finance, we do not provide de-risk investment. That's for the bank, that's for donors, that's for developing countries' own financing agenda. But we can work on the demand side. So creating the enabling context, supporting through technical assistance, planning, project design, procurement, tendering awards, creating the right context for projects to be well designed and to become bankable. So our role, it's on the demand side. Again, this has been overlooked. If you go to the FFT conferences, to all the discussion on financing, again, we just talk about financing, not about creating the context to make those projects bankable.
And to make them impactful, right? I mean, and you talk about that development or humanitarian to development or emergency to sort of recovery and long-term growth, that spectrum, if you will, has always been kind of a challenge in sort of getting that balance right, I think, in the development and humanitarian landscape. And just sort of picking up on that, I know we're coming down on our time together, but I'd be remiss, given your broad experience. Before joining UNOPS last year, you were the head of the Development Assistance Commission, I think I got that right, the DAC of the OECD, which is kind of like Major League Baseball, if you will, for the Americans out there, for 7 years. So you have a really broad view of the development, of the multilateral landscape. So, as you kind of look ahead, the Bretton Woods institutions coming up on, 80 years this summer, how do you think about, and what is maybe one change or a couple of key reforms that you see as necessary to, as you said, help kind of bridge some of these gaps you see in the multilateral and the finance and the implementation landscape? Big question.
Big question, and as you know, Nicole, we never abandon our experience even when we take a new job. Indeed, I was leading the DAC Secretariat and the Development Cooperation Director at OECD, and now I'm in the other side of the street, so I'm on the implementation side. So I think that I have a good observation of some of these elements, and in a humble manner, I would try to respond to your question. I think that we shall never waste, as we used to say, the opportunity that a crisis generates. And I think that 80 years after the Bretton Woods, 60 years after the creation of the DAC, we shall not waste this momentum to ask the question, do we have the right institutional approach, the right architecture on international cooperation, or do we need something different? And I think that there are reasons to say that we need something different. First, because the landscape changed completely. 8 years ago or 6 years ago, we were talking about a few number of countries that
Absolutely.
were the traditional donors. Now you have the southern providers, South-South cooperation.
Absolutely.
8 years ago or 6 years ago, you do not have blended finance or impact investment or philanthropy.
Right.
Philanthropy now represents $11 billion of finance to developing countries. 6 years ago, you did not have the climate as a top priority. Now climate is influencing all the landscape. So from a landscape point of view, new sources of finance, new protagonists, new standards also are something that you didn't have a few years ago. But also on the trends, and the trends are particularly worrying. As I mentioned, even when the finance goes up, it doesn't go to those most in need.
Right.
We just provide 4% of investment to preventing crises, and then we spend lots of money through humanitarian aid to overcome the consequences of the crisis that we do not prevent. We see that fragile contexts are not receiving all the support that is needed, and then we see some sort of fragmentation on the architecture.
Yeah.
So you have all these topics that I mentioned before: aid, investment, trade, debt, tax being dealt and addressed in different platforms. You don't have an inclusive approach because some of the providers don't have a seat in the table. Not only the southern providers, they don't have the seat in the table, but also the private finance and the philanthropy and NGOs, they don't really have a seat in the table. And then you have some institutions that are very strong on standards and norms, but they are not sufficiently inclusive. It's a small club. And you have other institutions that are pretty inclusive, but they don't have the standards and the norms, the accountability, and the learning. So I think that if I may make a wish,
Yes,
and it's something that I would say personally,
Yes.
not my current job, it's part of my experience for
Yes.
all the 30 years working on development and climate. I would love one day to see a place, an institution that could assemble all the providers, all the protagonists from all sources of finance, but at the same time an institution that would be able not only to have the enabling, the convening power for a dialogue, but also going towards standards, norms, accountability and learning. It's my wish for the celebration of these 8 years of the Bretton Woods.
Well, it's a beautiful wish, and in particular, I always talk about and say, people have heard it from me before, inclusive growth starts with inclusive governance. So to your point about how do we make these institutions more efficient, more collaborative, but also more inclusive, I think is a really wonderful note to end on. George, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Nicole.
I wish you well in the rest of these meetings. We have a lot more to do and say here at the Atlantic Council, so please continue to join and follow our events this week. You can see everything and all of the live analysis at atlanticcouncil.org. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Pleasure.